Welcome to video 4 notes on westward expansion and American Indians. So what you need to know after having taken these notes, and that's the most important part, right, is you don't just take these notes to sit back and watch a video. You're taking these notes to say at the end, do I know this stuff? So continued settlement of Americans in the West made for some conflict with American Indians and reinforce the policy of the reservation system. So here's what you need to know. You've got to explain how westward expansion impacted American Indians. And then you have to be able to describe this term here, assimilation. Also be able to describe the reservation system, so some vocab terms here, and then explain an example of how American Indians were forced to assimilate. And then describe two laws from the government that displaced American Indians from their land, that forced them off of their land. So, movement westward. European white settlers were moving from here, the east coast of the United States, and they were moving out west to where you go through like very arid, desert-like land, sometimes settling there and going a little bit further out. So industrialization led to increased demand for natural resources. We needed things like coal and iron ore. So people moved westward to find that coal and iron ore for those industries that these natural resources were so needed for. One thing that was drawing people out westward was something called the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, you need to make a note of this, maybe on the left side of your notes, by saying that this was one of the laws that displaced American Indians. This was a compilation of laws from the U.S. government that gave people land in the West. It encouraged people to move out there. It said if you cultivate the land for 5 years, you get to keep it for free. If you look at this advertisement over here, it says free lands for hundreds of thousands of families. Millions of settlers were then drawn out west. Millions of settlers were then drawn out west. Those millions of settlers, as they were going out there, were displacing American Indians. They forced them off of their land. So as we were just stating, the white European settlers lived over here and were moving westward. Well, it wasn't empty land over there, right? Like, sure, it wasn't cultivated, but there were Native American Indians living there. So Americans handled the American Indian problem in two ways. They displaced Indians from their land and put them onto reservations, and we're going to define what that is. But then also by forcing Indians to forget their culture and become American through something called assimilation. So let's define both of these. The reservation system. The reservation system, or reservations, were designated lands, and these still exist today, by the way. This picture down here is of an Indian reservation in North Carolina. It was designated land regulated by the Indian tribes, as in not the U.S. government, where Native American Indians were forced to live. They were physically forced off of their native land and put on these much smaller, albeit large acreage, but still smaller, areas of land. The goal was to keep Native Americans off of lands that European Americans wished to settle. And then this map over here just shows you where those reservations were. The Native American Indians used to have free reign of all of this land, right? And they used it well, for that matter, right? They lived off the land, and now they can only live in these very small pockets. So sometime after the Homestead Act, and as more people are moving out there and there's more and more conflict with Native American Indians, the government institutes the Dawes Act of 1887. You should make a note that this was the second law, right? This was the second law that the government made that forced Indians off of their lands. So it took Indian land, broke it up into lots for individual Indians to live on. Okay, so it took their land, broke it up into like blocks of land, and said, this family or this individual, you can live in this block, and gave them that land. And you might be thinking, well, it gave them land. What's the issue? Why was that a problem? Well, it's a big problem. because American Indians were living in tribes that would collectively own land, like on reservations even, but before reservations, they collectively lived together. No individual owned any land, and here they were trying to force American ways onto these Indians. So they did this. The goal was to assimilate and Americanize American Indians. Okay, so yes, it's part of the reservation system and forcing them onto specific lands, but in doing that, in forcing them to live as individuals on land, they were forcing American ways onto the Indians. Assimilation is the other vocab term that you need to know. This is when a minority group or culture comes to resemble the dominant group, right? The minority group is the not as strong group, which was obvious during this time because Native Americans stood no chance against European settlers' guns and other means of doing lots of damage. So that minority group of American Indians came to resemble American European settlers. So in many cases, this is also known as Americanization, and like in this case with Native American Indians. So you see these pictures of what these Native American Indian children in this case looked like in their native dress, and then what they looked like after Americanization in Indian residential schools. They had American haircuts, they wore uniforms that looked more American or European, you could say. It certainly didn't look like their native dress. And then the same over here. So how did they do this? How did they, quote, Americanize these Indians? They did this through Indian residential schools. These were boarding schools. You know, schools where people go and they live, right? They live on the campus. They were boarding schools where Native American children lived and went to school, right? They got an education. But the goal was not necessarily educating them, although it was, but it was more about forcing them to forget their native culture. Many of them were forced, almost abducted from their families. They were forced from their families. Look at these kids. They were so young, and they were forced away from their mother and father. They were given Euro-American haircuts and clothes, as we saw in that last picture. They were given new names. No longer did they have their native names. They were given American names, and oftentimes suffered all kinds of verbal, mental, sexual, physical abuse. It was not all the time, but that abuse was definitely there in a lot of cases. So some big takeaways here is making sure you understand how Indians were displaced from their land with those two laws, and then what assimilation is and how we assimilated, how Native Americans were assimilated or Americanized, and finally what that reservation system looked like and how Native American Indians were displaced from their land and forced to live on these reservations.